This presentation today is comprised to answer the question, how regulatory and political conditions act as barriers to supply chain management. To start, let's firstly think about our supply chain instead of our supply chain management. How political conditions influence the public necessity for the regulation, then implement the regulatory barriers. Then to tie it all in, what effects do those regulatory barriers have on actual supply chain management? To answer the presentation question, today this video will focus on the financial aspects such as Brexit, the flow of goods such as piracy, the sourcing of goods including national resource scarcity, and the distribution of goods including embargoes and sanctions. For a supply chain manager, the effects of negotiated trade agreements are one of the biggest influences on profitability of a product. The Brexit vote for Britain to leave the EU has created many barriers to hinder the free flow of goods throughout the region. If political stability between two nations in a supply chain break down, the reinstated trade barriers cause the cost of sourcing goods to rise, adding to the overall costs through the supply chain. This hinders the profitability of a supply chain manager, and that is why political issues such as Brexit, the Russia-Ukraine must be monitored for radical changes in policy that can affect supply chains. The prevention of piracy is dependent on a trading nation's political stance. The political changes can be seen with the frequencies of piracy-related costs reducing off of the African Horn and becoming more and more prevalent throughout Southeast Asia, especially through the Straits of Malacca and Singapore. Ways of reducing piracy have been shown by the US government, who implement smart power to engage and rehabilitate.
Private sectors need to address the situation of piracy with less diplomatic, military and financial expenses. Instead, they find innovation through ways of rerouting and minimising through security clearance of ships. The way that they rerouted was found with Maersk, where they rerouted their ships from the European markets to the Eastern markets. Instead of going through the Suez Canal, they instead headed around the Strait of Gibraltar and then around the Cape of Good Hope off the east coast of Madagascar into the eastern markets. This, however, added 8 to 14 days extra on delivery time and raised fuel bills 20 to 25%.
As a supply chain manager, the political issue of piracy is important to address due to the movement of goods through trade channels. The cost effectiveness of the supply chain is altered due to risks and dangers of piracy to the transporting vessels. An embargo is a powerful world trade tool that influences the flow of goods between nations, both military and economic. The current embargoes enforced by the UN include nations such as South Sudan, Syria, North Korea, Cuba, and Iran. To increase world trade, the use of embargoes is counterproductive. Sanctions have added 15% to the cost of trading with Iran, and lifting them will save the country some $15 billion yearly in cheaper trade with associated nations. However, the scope of what is restricted under an embargo is never quite complete across the board. Instead, there is a group of sanctions that are used to target specific industries.
Iran had their sanctions lifted in 2016. This generated a $27 billion order for a brand new 17 Airbuses. In 2001, the US-Cuba sanction was also lifted. This allowed for the state of Alabama to generate $124 million annually over 4 years.
As stated earlier, an embargo is counterproductive to world trade, but it is necessary to keep nations in line with obligations and international responsibilities. However, when an embargo is lifted, numerous sanctions are lifted also, but in the short term, it is like waking a sleeping giant. With economic sanctions easing, there are still nations that take regulatory practices to protect their national scarcity of resources by implementing controlled trade restrictions.
Japan's timber market has an import value of $10.9 billion and an export value of $185 million. This massive vulnerability in the import and export figures is due to Japan's forestry industry. The forestry industry in Japan is massively influenced by natural disasters and land area.
This creates a large opportunity for supply chain managers to avoid value-add stages in nations. With export and import restrictions, the goods will have an excess tax or duty to seize or deter actual movement of the goods through the nations. The efficiency of a supply chain for any organisation will and can be affected by political factors that are out of the control of private or government-owned enterprise. The forecasting and mitigation techniques are essential to reducing the devastating effects of political risk. The rise of political risk is due to a more globalized and international political arena over trade disputes, use of embargoes to control a nation's capability, trade negotiations, including Brexit, to reduce a nation's capacity to trade. A government also uses regulatory barriers to control the flow of goods, to reserve a nation's national security of resources. International piracy is discretional between private and government enforcement, as the operations are conducted usually in international waters, which entail causes damage to the goods and also reduces the flow of the goods. For supply chain managers, to remain in control of operations and consistently vigilant to changing trade regulations, political analysis must be conducted and understood, as political barriers do hinder trade through enforcement of regulatory barriers.